Inclusive Research presented by Lucy Serrett and Max Honor, AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
Hello, welcome to Inclusive Research by Max and Lucy. We'd like to start today with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which we engage from today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, as well as the traditional owners of the lands from where each of you are engaging from. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise their connection to the land and practice of knowledge sharing. Sovereignty was never ceded. To respect the privacy of the people involved in the research sessions discussed in this presentation, we've changed all names to be fake names.
We'd like to start off with a bit of a story. So Max and myself are sitting in a room about to conduct our first usability testing session for the day. I was sitting in my chair, distracting my nerves by shifting things around on the table, and then a young man sheepishly enters the room. This was Shannon, a 20-something-year-old with a cognitive learning disability. He slowly walks towards us, making eye contact and then looking around the space before sitting in his chair. I start building rapport with him and begin to relax into the session as we're all joking around and the conversation is starting to flow. After all the research formalities are done, I start asking some questions to Shannon, like, tell me a bit about yourself. Shannon's comfortable and he's sharing lots of interesting things about the things he likes and the things he does. I then ask him, so tell me, Shannon, when was the last time you went to a cafe or a restaurant? A really long pause begins to fill the room. Shannon begins to scrunch up his face like he's trying to squeeze the memory out of his brain. I give him some space and time to recall this moment. However, as the pause gets longer and longer and I can start to hear the crickets, I'm now questioning myself. How important is it for Shannon to recall this moment in time? I had put this question deliberately in the discussion guide, knowing that I had asked this question many, many times before. I've learned in UX research that it's important to get a person to anchor their experience to a recent memory, because it gets people reflecting on their own experiences rather than talking for others. But what does it mean for people like Shannon who struggle to recall memories? The lesson I learned from that moment was the importance of questioning the process, which fundamentally became one of the catalysts for Max and I to dive deeper into this topic and theme of inclusive research. We are so excited to share with you today our adventures and journey so far on this inclusive research journey. My name is Lucy Serrett and I am a senior user experience design consultant at Melbourne digital consultancy called Transpire. Our mission at Transpire is to weave humanity into technology, and that's pretty in line with the themes that we'll be sharing with you today.
I'm Max, I'm a UX design consultant at Transpire as well. And today we're going to be talking to you about what is inclusive research in terms of industry definitions. We'll be jumping into project inclusive research. We'll be looking at our approach, some of our key findings and key takeaways, as well as what's next for us.
So what is inclusive research? It's a fairly broad term and it can carry a number of different definitions depending on where in the world you are and what industry you're working from. It's a fairly new term, originally coined in 2001 by a couple of researchers called Jan Walmsley and Kelly Johnson, who focus on doing research with people with learning disabilities. They defined inclusive research as research that involves people who may otherwise be seen as subjects for the research, as instigators of ideas, research designers, interviewers, data analysts, authors, disseminators, and users. I relate this definition to the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," which again is talking about getting input and involving the people who will be impacted or influenced by the outcomes. Speaking from my own industry, as a UX designer, I need to speak to users. I need to test products with a diverse group so that I can ensure that the products I'm designing are accessible and usable to a diverse group. One way to visualize inclusive research is to think of it like a continuum. I have a diagram here on the screen, which is from Melanie Nin's book, What is Inclusive Research? The diagram has 4 circles overlapping each other in a horizontal line. From left to right, the first circle is labeled research-led, followed by part-led by researcher with some sharing, followed by the next circle, which is labeled part-led by participant with some sharing, and the 4th circle on the far right is labeled participant-led. What this diagram does really well is it showcases how the researcher and the participant roles can share more or less power in that research process. The limitations of this diagram and the overall definition of inclusive research are that there is still this undertone of ableism, this separation between us and them. There's this underlying assumption that researchers are people who don't have a disability, and people with disabilities are only involved in a participant capacity. Even if it was a participant-led research piece, the roles and contributions of people with disabilities are still only recognised as participants in this format, rather than researchers in their own right. Again, coming back to that story that I shared earlier on about Shannon, Max and I recognised in that moment, the research process works for some, but not everyone. And we fundamentally wanted to do some investigation and know why, and potentially how to fix it.
Which brings us to Project Inclusive Research. We took a human-centered design approach to this project. We began with our own assumptions from previous work and life experiences, and our aim was to improve the participant experience to make it more inclusive and accessible. Our dream would be to ensure that research doesn't just consider the view and perspective of every person in the world, but researchers then have a process to follow that would make sure research is fully inclusive and we can get inclusion in at the ground floor. Our approach, after we realized that our journey needed to indeed start with the researcher themselves and not the participant, we realized that we wanted to better understand the research process. And to begin, Lucy and I plotted out our own research process to use as a baseline to challenge some of our own assumptions and biases. We were then able to formulate a discussion guide and use both of these as a base to begin our understanding and exploration of each participant's research process. Our research objective was to better understand the experiences of someone who plans, facilitates, and synthesizes research. Who did we speak to? Over a week, Lucy and I conducted 7 30-minute contextual inquiries with a variety of people working in the technology and design industry. We selected this industry as it's the one that we happen to work in as well. In terms of participants, we had a mixture of genders, seniorities in roles and specializations, and we also recruited people who identified with a disability or a neurodiversity. The reason we recruited these individuals is because the project that had sparked a lot of this thought for us around what is inclusive research, we were working with people with disabilities and neurodiversity, so it was just made the most sense for us at the time. The participants that identified with the mixture of disabilities and neurodiversities included dyslexia, migraines, ADHD, anxiety, as well as some identifying with being hard of hearing and deaf. We used a technique called the fishbone mapping diagram technique, which is basically an activity. It's a cause and effect discovery tool that helps us figure out the variations, failures, and successes within each participant's own research process. We mapped the processes to a plan, as you can see there, of planning, recruitment, conducting, synthesis, and presenting. We also thought We also found it imperative, rather, to reimburse our participants for their time. It was important to us for the participants to feel as though their time had value. Which brings us to the key findings. So, writing. We asked our participants throughout the process, tell me a bit about writing documents. And many of our participants informed us that writing is not their strong suit. One participant saying reporting involves writing shit, and it's not my favorite. Almost all pointed out that they enjoy working with tools like Miro to get the bones of the work done and then collaborate with other team members to pull the information together into a document. Others mentioned that when it came to note-taking and user testing, they had quite a bit of anxiety about capturing the right data and then what it would mean for people to come back and read their notes. Would people understand? Would it cause more frustration? We can see this anxiety with a quote from one of our users. My English is not perfect and they find typing quite hard. Research plans also came up as a major point of frustration for many participants, some opting out completely out of the traditional research plan in favor of post-it notes on a Miro board, while others had premeditated company checklists or formulas that they used to help write research documents and really slash that time in half. Recruitment. How do you find the recruitment process is one of the questions we asked our participants, and recruitment came through as something that caused quite a bit of anxiety and frustration, from trying to organize people from different time zones and getting them set up on video conferencing softwares. This phase is rife with issues, with one user saying it is really hard working out all the details and making sure people come at the right time. We also heard from our users that they're often frustrated with the amount of people that they're doing research with, stating that the number of participants is very rarely enough. This quote here points to one user's belief around getting quality data from a high number of participants. You have to interview 15 people if you want to get a good sense. This is something that was repeated by a few of the participants that we interviewed. While talking to our participants, we found that many also had dedicated research teams that handled the recruitment and setup process. So there's definitely an inclination there that this is a big enough part of the process that entire teams can be dedicated to it.
The synthesis phase. So during the Fishbone activity, we asked people to reflect on their experiences synthesizing research. Some of the questions being, talk us through your process in synthesizing the insights. What tools do you use? What's the output from your synthesis? Synthesis was one of those most loved phases of the research process. Overall, there was a deep satisfaction for identifying patterns and seeing connections in what users did or said during interviews and usability testing. I have a quote here on the screen from a user who has dyslexia, who mentioned, synthesis it's challenging in a good way. The key challenges with synthesis often eventuated right at the beginning of that phase. Having a whole lot of unsorted data was very overwhelming for many and sometimes caused anxiety for people. To cope with the expansive nature of synthesis, multiple people mentioned their approach to chunking down this process into smaller bites. I have a quote here on the screen from a user who's diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia, who mentioned, it's too much info for me to process. If I chunk it down, it really helps me. Synthesis is a team sport, with many calling out the importance of this phase being done in a group. This can make or break the experience depending on the relationship and the dynamics within the team. Presenting. So we asked a couple questions about how people felt about that presenting phase. For example, tell us a bit about how and who you shared these research findings with, what tools did you use, who are you presenting these findings to and with. And what we discovered is that people's feelings towards presenting research was largely dependent on whether the outcomes of the research was well received by stakeholders or not. Research takes a lot of upfront time and effort to plan, conduct, and synthesize. And then when recommendations from the research are ignored from stakeholders, it can be a really frustrating experience. We have a couple of quotes here from users, one with dyslexia who mentioned, "It's not the communication part, it's the frustration of providing insights and it being ignored." Another one here from user 5 who is hard of hearing who mentioned, "It can be hard because you present such little work in meetings, but you have done so much work." Another key element to the success of presenting research was really around preparation and knowing your audience. The people we spoke to felt most comfortable presenting to people they knew. When presenting to new groups of stakeholders, typically more preparation was required as they had to build more context and storytelling around the research.
Remote work is best. So we asked our participants their opinion around working from home, especially given the last 2 years of everyone being in various forms of lockdown. And we found a large majority of people did actually have a strong preference for remote working, mostly because of the accommodations that it afforded them, being able to work the way that they needed to and ensure that they didn't burn out. We have a quote here from a user with anxiety who preferred to have time at home to find their balance again. "I suffer from anxiety and it's easier being remote," said user 6. We also found for those we tested with that identified as hard of hearing or deaf, they had a strong preference for remote working as video conferencing software made it easier for them to hear every voice clearly, and they were able to utilize such features like closed captions. There's a quote here from a user of ours that expressed a preference for remote working, saying, "Working face-to-face is harder than working remotely with my disability." That was user 5, who's again hard of hearing. From the group we spoke to, there's also a larger preference for this idea of collaborative work, which, funnily enough, also preferred to be remote. From Slack huddles to Miro boards, there's no shortage of ways to collaborate and tools to utilize. Our users, or participants rather, also seem to suggest that it lowered the anxiety, being able to participate in every part of the process as a group when they wanted to and in ways that they wanted to engage. Group work actually brings me to the next key finding of ours, which was it takes a village, doesn't it just, Lucy? Do you work with other people during this stage of the process is a question we often asked our users. And from the users we spoke to, teamwork came through strongly as something that they valued really highly. We found some of our users citing that a good team can make or break the project. We heard that a lot, and I think Lucy mentioned it just before as well. And we also found that the teamwork mentality meant that people felt more supported, from having someone sit on your user tests to take notes to ensure you're capturing all of the right data, or having another person perhaps watch how many tests you're doing within a day to ensure you don't burn yourself out. And we have a quote here from a user expressing some thoughts on that exact idea. "I don't want people to burn out." User 1 with dyslexia just happened to lead a team of designers, and a lot of their day was spent making sure everyone was resourced correctly and no one was going to be overworked. And it's really important that we have these team structures, or that these team structures are evident, because it's integral to the success of the team. There's also an understanding that our users found work to be much more refined when they were able to share the synthesis journey. Some even spending hours on remote tools to work together to find solutions or to synthesize the work. We can see this in the final quote here from user 3 who has chronic migraines. They've said, "It's a whole day session. We'll duck in and out of the synthesis meeting."
Disclosure of disability and neurodiversity. This was a really interesting theme that sort of organically came up. We weren't really actively trying to test or learn or discover in this area, but naturally it came up in conversation. And when it did, we asked users, do you share with your team your disability or neurodiversity? What we discovered was that people who tended to disclose their disability or neurodiversity tended to have a more positive experience at work and were less likely to be misunderstood by their peers. We have a quote here from a user with ADHD and dyslexia who shared a story of, not disclosing to their team. The quote says, "It caused problems because I wasn't honest." The disclosure of disability and neurodiversity was often met with empathy when we heard these stories from users. Co-workers asking how they could support them or making accommodations for them in the physical space or within the project as well. We have another quote here from a person with chronic migraines who mentioned, "Sometimes I just need to lie on the floor and my team are fine with that." Misconceptions of people's disability or neurodiversity came up also several times in the research, particularly misconceptions about someone's ability to perform their role or to excel at a certain task. The people we spoke to who identified with an invisible disability or neurodiversity shared some of the qualities or the ways of working and their ways of thinking which benefit the research process. We have a couple quotes here. One from a user who has autism and Asperger's syndrome, who mentioned in relation to their experience conducting user interviews, one advantage is you have tunnel vision, which means I can focus on that aspect. And again, I think it's a really interesting point about, especially when you're conducting user interviews and you hear something that the user says, and then being able to, it is such an incredible skill to be able to really dig further and dig further and dig further into that discussion and really get the base insight out of that conversation. On the other side of the coin, we have a user here with dyslexia who was talking about how much they love the synthesis phase and how they find it quite an easy and, I guess, efficient process. And they mentioned, "I don't think it's a disability. I can see connections quicker." Again, talking about more of those qualities and benefits of their neurodiversity. Our lucky last insight for you today is, what's your flavor? Tell me what's your flavor? Probably not much of a big surprise to you all, but based on the research we conducted, we discovered that everyone enjoyed a different flavor of the research process. Some people loved conducting or observing interviews and testing sessions. Others really enjoyed the synthesis phase. We spoke to some people who really benefited and loved sharing findings and presenting to stakeholders. Based on the people we spoke to, there was something for everyone in the research process. We have a couple quotes here on the screen, I guess really just to illustrate this point. User 3, who had chronic migraines, mentioned in relation to the synthesis, "It's my favorite part of the research process. I love seeing the patterns emerge." We have a quote here from user 6, who's hard of hearing, who mentioned in relation to that planning and setup phase of the research, "I actually like this bit a lot. You can get really nerdy here."
So that leads us to some of our key takeaways. A project shared is a project halved. Promote collaborative work. It decreases anxiety and results in more diversity of thought. Probably not something that's all that surprising, but allowing people to work together collaboratively to find solutions often works out better for the team and the solutions that they're finding.
Your research should reflect the real world. Test with more people and include neurodiverse people and people with disabilities in your research, both as researchers and participants. The world is so diverse and so are your users. If you don't have exposure to the people you're creating for, they will be left out. And it's the same with research teams. If you don't have diversity within your team, your cognitive biases will skew your research and it will have a huge impact on your research outcomes.
Kick off with a team charter. This is something that will identify ways of working that will actually work for your team. Identify your team's strengths, weaknesses, preferred communication styles, and preferred tools. This will allow people to come to work, know that their strengths are being utilized, their weaknesses are going to be supported, and they're going to be able to communicate in the way that works best for them.
Flexible work. Champion flexible work arrangements. Give people a choice to work remotely and empower them to plan their day around their needs. We spoke to someone who suffers from chronic migraines who mentioned how her workplace took the light bulbs out of the ceiling above her desk in the office, again, to make that physical space more comfortable and accessible to her. We heard from another individual who had anxiety, who mentioned how they benefited from working remotely so they could have more alone time in their day and recharge after meetings. Flexible work benefits everyone, and that is employee and employer alike.
Tools are meant to be tools. Empower your team to choose the tools that work for them. Embed transcription tools into your process. This one is pretty interesting because there is so many tools out there that can help people work better. It's about doing a little bit of extra research, finding the ones that work for you, and then presenting it back to your team and saying, does everyone mind using this tool because it's going to help me in the long run?
Our lucky last key takeaway is foster psychological safety, creating a culture where team members can be honest and bring their authentic self to work. We learned from this research that when people disclose their needs to their team, it had a really positive and long-lasting impact on their well-being and the overall team experience. For people to feel comfortable to disclose their disability or neurodiversity, you need to start with a psychologically safe environment with trust and respect at the core. Everyone has a role to play in fostering this, so be kind and be patient.
So what is next for Lucy and I?
Max and I recognize that we are just at the beginning of this journey, and we have really only been scratching the surface of the tip of the iceberg. But what we hope to achieve today is really to share where we're up to in this investigation of making research more inclusive for everyone, focusing initially on the researcher experience. Next steps from here is we'll be continuing this investigation using mixed method approaches and digging further into these findings that we've shared with you today. We're also going to begin kicking off the other side of the coin and investigating how can we make the participant experience more inclusive. This journey all started with a story, which triggered a light bulb moment that the research process works for some, but not everyone. And so with the last thing I'll say is stay curious and keep questioning, who does your process leave out? Thank you so much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
AliCamp 2021.